Hello friends, I am FriendlyCosmonaut, and today I am going to step you through an introduction to GameMaker. So let's jump in. If you haven't already, let's hop over to the GameMaker website, hit download, and download the appropriate installer for your operating system. So I have downloaded this version of GameMaker, and when I had finished and opened GameMaker, I had this little pop-up. So it's worth pointing out that if you have signed up with Opera, you will have a lot of these modules freely available. This might not be coming up for you if you have not and you have not linked your account. No huge fuss either way, as you can always do that later. It's worth pointing out that you will want to look at this when you get around to exporting your game. It's essentially what we can actually target. So if we want to build for different operating systems, these are the modules that we're going to need to download, but we don't need to worry about that right now as we are just testing. So I'm going to leave that be and just hit OK. All right, so when we open up GameMaker, we will see the landing screen. So I have a bunch of projects already. I've been using GameMaker for quite a few years, so you can see there's a lot here. Yours might be blank. Obviously, that's totally fine. So you can see some of the Opera and Yo-Yo resources available here that we can have a little look at, but let's go ahead and hit New. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Game. It's going to just set us up with the base project. There are templates here as well, where they have some sample projects that we can have a look at. But to avoid getting overwhelmed, let's keep it simple. Let's just go blank. Alrighty, and now we can name it. So feel free to call this whatever you want. As a rite of passage, I'm going to keyboard mash and go with that because this is kind of just a test project and I'm just going to be having a look around. Great, so this is GameMaker. Over on the left, we have the inspector. When we are actually clicking on resources, we're going to get properties coming up here that we can play with. Over on the right, we have all of our actual resources. So we're going to be looking at these in a lot more detail as we go. And it's also worth having a little hover over all of these ones. So here is all of your basic file, open, save kind of buttons. This one is probably one we're going to be hitting a lot. So this is to actually run the game. So we can actually do that right now. So if I hit play or run, mine is currently set to compile to Windows. So yours might not actually be doing that. Yours might have been set to run on GX Games or something else. So any of those are fine for testing. You will notice that they will run slightly differently. I probably recommend just running it in whatever your operating system is. So if it's currently set to GX Games and you're, for example, running it on Windows, it's probably worth downloading the Windows export. Again, if you haven't actually signed up for Opera and need to log in, you might need to do that first, and then you will be able to download and use that export. As I was saying though, when we actually run the game, you can see that what is coming up is just a black empty void. So this is what we start off with in our project. So if I close that again, you can see on the right here that it's blank except for this room. So this is essentially the only thing that we need to run a game. So our rooms are kind of like the stage or world or level or node, as you might have seen in other game engines. So the container for everything where we place all of our objects, where all of our gameplay is actually happening. We can have multiple rooms in the game, or we can just have one. So you can see when I've clicked on it, its settings, its properties have come up over here on the left. And like I said, just like its analogs in other game engines, a room as a container often has some pretty similar settings. So it often has a width and height, some sort of dimensionality, and then you'll have other things that are specific to GameMaker. So you can see it has some physics settings, some viewports and cameras. I'm not going to go into those ones today. We are really just looking at the overview of a lot of these settings. So I'm going to leave that be, but let's double click on the room, open it up. So as we just saw, this room is just a black container. It does have a width and height, so it does have properties about it. And this is the default 13662.768, which is a bit of a quirky number, but a holdover from old monitors and screens. These days, we are probably more used to 16:9 ratios, but that is the default. So you can also see that this has brought up another tab right here. So we can switch between these to go back to the workspace. And yeah, when I switch back to that, the room is still there, so I can hop back to that. I can always close it, reopen it again. I can close the workspace too, and then reopen it here. I can also play with some of these tabs, so I can actually close all of them here, which can be really helpful, especially when we start to use some of the other editors and we want a little bit more space. You can bring up them individually with these little tabs here. You can also undock some of these and have them as kind of floating docks. You can move them to the other side and really customize the layout as you want. But it is very possible to do that accidentally or to get some of these tabs into places that we don't want them to. So if that ever happens and we want to just restore the original, we can always go to layouts and reset layout. And that will kind of refresh the project. Okay, so now that we have that done, let's actually start to make a more interesting room right now. As we just saw, we have a black rectangle. Let's start to add some actual objects. So we are going to have a look over here at the resources. So you can see a lot of things here: fonts, objects, sounds, sprites, and so on. Let's maybe start with sprites. So these are how we represent textures in GameMaker. So, and by textures, I mean an image. So I am going to right click over here in the resources panel. So I can actually click anywhere to make any kind of resource. I don't actually have to click specifically in the sprites to make a sprite. And in fact, I can actually just delete that folder altogether if I don't like that. Just worth pointing that out. So like I said, we can just make a sprite by clicking on sprite here. And you can see it has just put it in the base sort of root of this resource tree. And I can drag it wherever I want. I could drag it into objects. I could drag it into shaders, but it obviously makes more sense for me to drag it right into sprites. And I'm going to keep it here. All right, and you can see that a sprite editor has opened up in the workspace. So I am going to collapse all of my dock panels so that I can have a bit of a better look at the sprite editor. And you can see it's sort of moved into the top left. Worth also knowing that we can move around the workspace itself if we middle click. So on the scroll wheel, if you have a scroll wheel on your mouse, middle click that, hold it, and then move, you will actually move around the workspace. So we can kind of orient it so that the editor itself is a little bit more centered. I can actually play with this dock as well and change its size. I can also zoom in and out. If I hold Control and then use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, I can zoom in and out of this resource. However, you can see it kind of distorts the texturing of the editors. So you can see if I zoom in, the fonts are looking quite pixelated. And if I've been messing around with that for a little bit, I might be struggling to get it so that it actually looks nice as it did as the default. So if I want to do that, I can always hit zoom reset. So this one right here. And now we have everything back to normal, looking as it should. All right, so we can't do much actually outside of the editor itself until we actually have an image here. So let's go edit image. And now we are in the image editor. So this is where we can actually draw the sprite. So GameMaker has its own built-in sprite editor. So over on the right here, we have brushes, we have colors, and I can just kind of click to draw, and the same rules that apply to the workspace also apply here for maneuvering around the editor. So middle click and moving around to move within the editor, and I can scroll in and out as well. And I can also use these buttons as well to play with it. So amongst these actually is the grid. That can be quite useful if you're trying to get proportions just right. So you can turn on the grid and you can also control the size of the grid and also control the snapping. So if we were to move the image around and we wanted it to snap, let's say to every 16th pixel, we can turn that on right there. I'm actually going to hit Control A and delete to just delete all of that. And I'm just going to draw a silly sprite for now. I'm going to draw maybe let's do a bunny. And I apologize in advance. I am not a great artist, so a lot of my drawings end up looking a little bit cursed. So take a moment to play around with the tools just so that you can get an image of any kind so that we can start to populate the room with it. All right, great. So this is my bunny, vacuous blob of uncertainty, but that's okay. Once we are done with that, it is worth having a look up here that we can add multiple frames. So if you wanted to animate the image, let me just click on this plus right here. We can add frames within the editor itself. So that would be the first frame. And now over here is the second frame. So at the moment, this one is blank. And I could go ahead and maybe animate the bunny doing something, maybe moving slightly, maybe sitting or jumping or whatever I want. There is this handy setting here called onion skinning. So again, you might have seen that in other programs, and yeah, this is how GameMaker does it. So if we just turn that on, we can see where the previous frame is and then kind of use that as a stencil to draw the next one. So again, take a moment, maybe even draw a few frames to animate your little object doing something. I'm going to keep mine quite simple and just stick with 2 frames to just liven it up a bit and make it move slightly. All right, so that is my second frame. So if we want to preview this live, we can actually hit this little play button right here. And for me, at least, this is animating really quickly. It's actually quite jarring. I'm going to hit stop right there. So if we wanted to slow that down, we can come back out of the sprite editor. So I can just swap back to the workspace. Again, if you close it, just remember that you can hit the little plus here to reopen it. But I'm just going to click this. Or I could actually come back to the resource and double click on my sprite to reopen the sprite editor. So now we can come back to the general settings of the sprite. We can see up here is the FPS. So this is going to control the speed that the animation is actually playing. Right now it is 30 FPS. That is why it is playing so quick. So I'm going to turn this right down to something like 2 and then hit play again to have a look. That is going to look just fine for me. So I can actually come right back to the room and you click on your sprite and you drag it into the room. So it's not quite as easy as that. So it's coming up with a little dialog box to say that this asset, so this asset or resource, which is a sprite, can only be applied to an asset layer and you do not currently have one selected. So what this is actually talking about is over here in the left, we have the layers of the room. So kind of like in an image editor where you can have multiple layers on top of each other. So you can have, for example, the base layer or the background, and then you can have the foreground with the things on top. Just so in the room editor as well. And not only can we have different layers with different names, but there are actually different types of layers. So we can have layers that are backgrounds. We can have layers that are containing objects, and then we can even have more than that. So we can have effect layers that produce visual effects on the game. We can have what's called a path layer, tile layers. For now, we will stick to the basics. So that is going to be the background, instances, and as this says, an asset layer. So I'm actually going to hit cancel just for now, and we're going to look at what we've already got. So over here, and I'm going to just drag this down. In this little panel, we already have a background layer and an instances layer. So these are just containers for different types of assets. So if we wanted to add objects to the room, we need to actually put them in this instances layer. We can also use background layers to just show an image. And like it said, we can also have what's called an asset layer. So this one right here, where we can place different assets about the room. And you might be wondering, for example, what the difference then is between the asset layer. So let's actually just click that right now, and the background layer. And essentially it's all to do with the properties, because they are both layers to do with images. We can put images on each layer, but the key difference I would say is that the background layer can only have one type of asset, one type of sprite on it, whereas the asset layer can have multiple. So we might want to put trees, grass, essentially any objects that we want to be present in the game. As in the theater, we might consider them sort of setting or stage dressing on top of what is the background of the stage setting. But let's get to know the background layer first anyway. So come over to the background, make sure we've clicked it, and we are looking at its properties here. So we can have a scroll through to see all of its properties. We can see right now that its color is black. So we can go ahead and change that if we want. So right here, we can have a play around with the color. Or we can use a sprite. So I am going to click this, Sprites, and then I'm going to click my bunny. Already, we can actually play with some other of these settings. So at any point as we go through these resources, I highly encourage you to kind of just stop the video and have a click randomly on a lot of these boxes and a lot of these settings, and just play with the numbers, play with the settings, and see what happens, because I think that is kind of the best way to learn. I'm going to do a little bit of that with you. So I'm going to, for example, let's click on the tiling. And yeah, we can see that it has tiled or repeated the image horizontally. There we go. And if we click vertically, it does the same thing vertically. So we can have one or both or neither of those. And now if I click stretch, you can see that it kind of fits the image to the entire room. And you can see even if I've clicked all of them, so I've clicked the tiling and I've clicked stretch, the stretch is kind of overriding that because it's stretching the whole image. Another thing we can do is actually preview the scene. So if there are any sprites in the scene that you've got, so whether it's in backgrounds or in assets, if you hit play, it will actually play the animation of any of those sprites. So mine, as you remember, is pretty subtle. It's just the bunny moving slightly. If you had something more interesting, you might be able to see that. Now, another fun one is actually this speed. So it's a little bit unclear what this is going to do for now. You might be thinking it's going to affect the animation, but if I just turn that up 1, you can see that that actually makes the entire background scroll at a rate of 1 pixel per frame. And I can do a similar thing with the Y. So that is making it move at 3 pixels per frame. Now, this might be a little bit interesting to you. So you might have expected it to actually go up, but it is going down. So it is worth noting that GameMaker, its XY axis. So if we think of it as a sort of Cartesian plane graph coordinate dimension, that the 0, 0 origin of the room is not down here as you might be used to in other programs. It is actually up the top. So it's at the top left. So 0, 0 on the X and the Y axis is here. And to increase on the Y axis, we are actually going down, not up. So that is going to become important when we look at movement later, but interesting for now as we are just playing with some of these settings. So now that we have that going and we're having a little play around, it's actually worth having a little run of the game. So I'm going to hit play, it's going to compile the game, and something very strange is going to happen. So this we can consider as our first bug in GameMaker. So a bug in programming essentially just means unexpected behavior. Sometimes we get an error that also crashes the program. So it's something that forces the program to stop because it's not working. It might hit a bit of code that doesn't make any sense. It might hit a bit of a syntax error or so on. But sometimes the game might actually work. So it might keep running. It's just that it might look a little bit strange. So in this case, it's just a visual bug. We are getting this odd smearing effect and perhaps we don't really know why and we have to fix it. So a really good way to get into the mindset of debugging is to consider the game running frame by frame. So on the first frame, we start with just nothing. And then we have a background in our room and the game draws that background, which is our tiled sprites. So far so good. And we don't have anything else in the game. So that's pretty much all that happens. So first frame done. Now, second frame of the game. What happens now? Well, we draw the background again. So remember that the background is actually composed of just our bunny sprite. And our bunny sprite doesn't contain pixels that have any color outside of the bunny. So they are transparent pixels, which means that the old frame containing the position of our old bunny is not getting wiped. It is not getting cleared. So we actually just add another bunny frame on top at a different position. So it actually makes a lot of sense why this is happening. It's not like the program is running incorrectly or anything. It's just a reality of what we're drawing. We're not drawing anything on top of the old frame, and inherently GameMaker just doesn't wipe the old frame. So if we do want it to do that, we have to add either pixels to our sprite outside of where the bunny is, or we have to draw something else. So perhaps another layer behind our bunny that does wipe the pixels. So we can do that literally by adding another background layer that is just a color. So keep in mind that when we add another background layer, if I want this one to draw behind the bunnies, I have to move this down. And then on that background layer, I could, for example, change the color or something. There we go. Run the game again. And now it is behaving like how I sort of originally expected. So we are drawing the background and then the bunnies, and then on a new frame, we draw the background again, which replaces all of the old pixels and colors, and then the bunnies again on top at their new location. So great, we have solved that bug. what if we want to place these bunnies at different locations and actually kind of populate the room with sprites? So let's take another look at our asset layer. So I'm actually going to delete the layer that I have my bunnies on. There we go. I'm going to keep the one that has just a blank color on it. And I'm going to use this asset layer now. So I'm going to click on the asset layer. If you don't have that yet, or if you deleted it, just go ahead and click on this one again. Or you can actually just drag the sprite in, and when it prompts you to create an asset layer, just go ahead and click OK. After that, you can drag in these sprites, just like that. And you can actually drag in multiple as well. So these create individual kind of sprite graphics within the level. And each of these can be manipulated and have their own properties. So they have a position. So this one is different to this one because it has different properties and a different location. It also has a different scale, rotation, color, flip, the frame that it begins on, and even a speed. So we can alter all of these just about this particular one, and it won't alter the other one. So for example, I could make this twice as big. So I can do it within this editor here, or I can use the widgets. So I can scale it. I can also rotate it, and I can tint the color. So I could tint this, for example, let's do this on red. I could tint this one green and place this one here, rotate it in a different way. It is worth noting where it's rotating the image from. So no matter where I'm sort of using this widget from, it always rotates the image from the top left of the sprite. So you can see, even if I sort of do it from here, it's always that one. And that will go for all of the sprites that are the bunny. So if I double click here, we can actually change that. So again, I'm just going to dock the other panels and have a look at the sprite. So the property that controls this is called the origin of the sprite. So think of a piece of paper and imagine putting a pin through that paper and then turning the paper around that pin. So that is kind of acting like the origin of the piece of paper or the sprite. It controls how it's going to rotate and also its actual position. So wherever we put this, and I can actually click and move this around freehand to whatever position I want. So I could put it in the middle, I could put it on the ears, on the little toes, wherever I want it. I can also use some of these presets. So I can use, for example, middle center, top left, bottom center. A lot of the time you will see that as you start to make your game, this will start to become standardized for a lot of assets so that you have a kind of common anchor point. Perhaps you usually want the anchor point to be kind of at the sprite's feet, or where it is tied sort of to the Y plane of the world. So if I just put mine there and head back to the room and rotate it again, you can see now it rotates about the middle. So that will become important later when we start to manipulate the objects within the game. But for now, it's sort of just a quirk of how we're playing with the sprites. So feel free to populate your room how you like, have a little play with some of those properties. I'm going to leave it there for today, now that we have had a play with backgrounds and sprites, and we'll dive into logic and actual gameplay in another video. So thank you for watching. I'll catch you in another video.